Hello, class, and welcome back. This is chapter 3. We are going to be talking about biocultural evolution. Evolution is defined as the adaptive changes in populations of organisms across generations. So, what does this mean? Sleeping is a biocultural phenomenon. So, what this means is it has both biological dimensions as well as cultural and behavioral dimensions. Cultural and behavioral dimensions are patterned by social expectation, moralities, and paraphernalia. Um, Humans evolved particular sleeping patterns. So, this is whether or not the family sleeps together, how they sleep together, if they are in the same room, in the same bed, if the child sleeps in a crib or in a bassinet, are just a few of the different options that are possible. So, what does it mean to say evolves? Evolution is not the same as simply changing. Evolution is both a body of factual evidence and a theory. So we use both prehistoric and historic evidence when we're looking at different evolutionary patterns. There's really no truth with a big capital T or fact with a big capital F anymore. Um, as we know things change over time, our theories also evolve with new information that is gathered. So a change over time is tied to the variation in the present. There are many different examples of this, but I won't bore you with it currently. So variations in physical traits are closely related to a life form's survival. Um, this can be found if you look at the New York rats back in, I believe it was the 20s. There was a huge boom in the rat population in New York City, and they used a certain type of pest control. That pest control got rid of the healthier rats, while those that weren't considered as healthy and were typically killed off by the healthier rats ended up becoming the dominant population because they were resistant to the poison that was put out. So they adapted and changed and evolved through that. Yay. In New York City, they have super rats. So changes that come about through adaptation are key, like the rat. So how and why did evolutionary thinking come about? The dominant explanation in Western culture about the origins of life combined classical Greco-Roman philosophy and Judeo-Christian Islamic theology. So that means there's a great chain of being. All life is hierarchically done. This very cool photo shows the degrees with God being at the top. And you see that it's floral or plant life, fauna, animals, and then you go up here and you have the working class and humanoids, and this can be broken down even further, but then you have the angels and then the archangels and God. So that kind of shows the order of progression from least to most important. So essentialism, things don't change from their essential form. Um, and that's part of what this photo is showing you, is that you have the form, like a tree doesn't change. It just is. It can never move up the chain of order of importance. So, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. These are the two that came up with the theory of evolution. They said that variation is a result in the interaction between organisms and their environment. Variations do not arise from a desire to change, but are found in pre-existing traits of individuals within the population. Look back to the rat example that I gave you. It was those that had the immunity already to the poison that ended up surviving, and therefore the population evolved, kind of. Um, so, new theory called the descent with modification through natural selection. Natural selection. That's the biggest part of evolution that we need to look at, is natural selection. They offered a coherent theoretical framework with explanationary power, one that was open to empirical testing. The empirical testing portion is very important, because if you can't test a theory, then it doesn't really do anything. So, adaptation and relational change. A natural selection does not force or guide the process, but processes of selection among traits that provide fitness in a particular environment. Okay, so for Darwin, the mechanism of adaptation was natural selection. Like I said, it just provides the fitness for a particular environment. So it's how that species will best be able to interact and succeed within the environment that's important. Evolution is non-directional, so it's not progressive or linear. It doesn't necessarily lead toward improvement. It just leads, it goes for the traits that enable success within a species. Evolutionary changes always happen in relationship with other factors, primarily environmental conditions, and what other life forms are up to. So it's really talking about the relationship between the environment and the other species, and how best to that whatever species you're talking about is able to deal with and procreate, basically. So, so we're going to talk about the relationships between descendants and ancestors. You can definitely look at Mendelssohn and his plant theory when we're talking about this. If you know anything about that, it's recessive and dominant genes. But anyway, so describe relationships between descendants and ancestors. Ancestral characteristics, traits, or structures shared by all or most species in a group are inherited from a common ancestral species. So, derived characteristics are unique to a species, evolved after two or more species who shared a common ancestor um, diverged. So, a very good example of this is looking at our own Homo sapien or Homo sapien sapien lineage and the split between ourselves and the bonobo and or chimpanzee and our differences there. So there are shared derived characteristics, traits that evolved after all species being compared shared a common ancestor, but prior to the more recent specialization events. So, constructing using morphology, molecular, and fossil data. Scientists look for three features: the ancestral, derived, and shared derived characteristics that I just explained above. So, understanding the distinctions. Um, so, you want to be able to understand the distinctions between traits, and that helps us to see evolutionary relationships between the different species. For anthropologists, this means understanding and origins of a species, in particular the human species, as that is our main focus, what it means to be human. Also identifying the evolutionary changes that made our species the distinctive species that it is today. Specific traits that we share with other creatures who we have a common ancestor with, and making sense of biological and cultural variations between the human population. We do this by looking at other primates and how they differ. A very good example of that is looking at the cultural and biological differences between the bonobo and the chimpanzee. They are very closely linked, but we actually share more DNA with the bonobo than we do with the chimpanzee. Uh, they do look a lot alike, but act completely different. Modern synthesis. So, modern synthesis is the view of evolution that accepts the existence of four genetically based processes of evolution: mutation, natural selection, gene flow, and genetic drift. So, these four processes are form the basis of a single unified theory of evolution during the second half of the 20th century. Key features of the modern synthesis are evolution can only be measured across generations and within population. So that's kind of important to understand. Also, know that a population is defined as a cluster of individuals of the same species who share a common geographical area and find their mates more often in their own cluster than in others. Basic sources for biological change. One of the basic sources is genes, a segment of DNA that contains a code for a protein. This is a basic unit of information for living things and is the primary means by which individuals pass on biological information to their offspring. Variation in genes is at the heart of the biological variation in organisms and acts as a basic source for biological change. deoxyribonucleic acid, also known as DNA. DNA has this beautiful double helix. It's a spiral-shaped molecule strands that contain biological information for a cell. DNA is inherited from both of our parents. A significant part of what DNA does is related to the physical and chemical structure. The main function of DNA. So it has two main functions, replication and protein synthesis. So protein synthesis is how the DNA assists in the creation of the molecules that make up the organism. Replication is the process in which it copies itself. Replication is necessary for two of the primary functions of cells, mitosis and meiosis. So mitosis is the process of cells dividing and replicating. You definitely want your cells to divide and replicate. Every cell does that, your skin cells, everything, because there's a time limit on each cell. Meiosis is the process of gamete production. So, definition of genes. A segment of DNA that contains a sequence for a protein, as we said a little bit earlier. All humans have the same genes, but for most of the genes, a number of different nucleotide sequences make up the protein messages. Alleles within the genes are the variants in the DNA sequences for a given gene. Comparing the DNA sequences of individuals, groups, or species helps us to understand molecular patterns. This provides a method independent of morphological comparison for testing hypotheses about taxonomic status and evolutionary histories of different species, whether creatures are connected through common ancestors or not. So, the processes of evolution. We've already said that mutation, natural selection, gene flow, and genetic drift are the four ways through which evolution happens. Reminder again, mutation is the variations that arise with the change at the DNA level. Natural selection happens over time, and it allows for the more successful genetic variations to become more common within a population. Gene flow is the movement of DNA through migration and mate selection. Genetic drift is the change in genetic variation across generations due to random factors. Okay, extended evolutionary synthesis. Newer views that accept the existence of genetically based and non-genetically based processes of evolution. We have four of them. So developmental bias, this is the physical development, can influence the generation of variation. Plasticity, the environment directly shapes organisms' physical traits. So that means that it can and does change. The environment can and does change the physical traits of an organism, such as the human body, and our pigmentation is changed due to the amount of melanin that is within our skin is based on our ancestral locations and the need to either be able to soak up more sunlight from the sun or to be able to reflect that sunlight out and get more out of it for less light. Yeah, best way to describe it. So a niche construction is organisms directly modify their environment. An extragenetic inheritance, organisms transmit more than genes across generations. The modern synthesis does not capture the full gamut of observed evolutionary processes, though. So, developmental bias. Developmental bias is the developmental process organisms undergo tend to generate certain forms more readily than others. Organisms adapt to their environment and become multiple species. Um, this is when the divergent branches within an ancestral tree happen, more or less. So, adaptations may happen over varying periods of times, sometimes within an organism's lifespan. That's the plasticity. That means that it can change either rapidly if necessary or extraordinarily slowly, depending on the process that is needed. So, a niche construction, when organisms play an active role in their evolution by reshaping the environment to suit their own needs. We definitely see this within the human species, as we are masters of niche construction. We modify our environment through agri- agriculture, technology, and other means in which we have shaped our own evolution. And so, extragenetic inheritance. This is the socially transmitted and epigenetic factors that can aid in the adaptive success of an organism. Um, Epigenetics can influence fertility, longevity, and disease resistance within individuals. Such environmental factors create chemical changes in how DNA express ourselves, though it is not the underlying sequences. Reference melanin. How do biological patterns affect evolution? Biocultural perspective recognizes genetic and non-genetic patterns of evolution. This is rooted in the constructive approach. Um, a core dynamic of human biology and culture is the construction of meaning, social relationships, and ecological niches, and developing bodies. Non-genetic systems of inheritance, epigenetic, behavioral, as well as symbolic. So, the epigenetic is the biological aspects of bodies that work with genes and their proteins and the proteins that they produce. Behavioral, this is the pattern behaviors young learn through teaching and imitation or enculturation. Symbolic, this is the linguistic system through which humans store and communicate their knowledge and conventional understandings using symbols. Remember, language is most definitely a symbol and a symbolic system. Niche construction, changing and constructing the world around us can change the natural selection pressures. This can make it so that we don't have to have as many pressures on our system, and therefore there's not really much need to evolve, or just the opposite happens. So reorganizing the ecosystem creates conditions for co-evolutionary processes. Organisms can mutually shape each other's evolutionary prospects, thus niche construction creates an ecological system of inheritance. This most definitely means that everything we live within and around does affect us as well as we affect them. Development system theory, or DTS, rejects the idea that there is a gene for anything. It argues that bodily development comes from the growth and interaction of several distinct systems: genes, cells, muscles, bones, brain, and the nervous system. So, disease and evolution. Human history is marked by the constant circulation of population-shaping diseases. We are looking at one right now, actually. Each disease outbreak that kills population means the loss of a set of genetic complexes. Biocultural practices shape the experiences and effects of diseases. Evolutionary pressures of diseases affect different populations differently because of the different accesses to health care. If you look at our COVID-19 problems, you can most definitely see, especially within Milwaukee, the disparity between the racial groups and the access to health care. Those that are dying, those that are recovering, those that have the underlying health problems that make recovering that much harder. It's quite outstanding, the difference that the outbreaks have on populations as a whole. Hopefully, we won't see nearly as horrific of a change in our population as we did even with the Spanish flu back in 1918 or the bubonic plague. But you know, our cultural practices, whether or not we do the 6 feet of social distancing, wearing our masks, actually wearing our masks correctly, all those things do tend to shape the experience and the effects of the diseases, how well we do and how well we do not do. So, cultural practices and evolution. Cultural practices have the capacity to alter human morphology. So there's a variable of access to nutrition might help explain differences in body shapes and forms between and within human populations. And this is definitely the case as we get going with our societies. We have noticed that there has been a dramatic increase in the height of the Homo sapiens. This is definitely due to the difference in diet and daily activity. But there's also the difference in body modification that comes into play with it. So, unless practices actually affect fitness, it may not have any long-term evolutionary impact. So, of the different piercings that people have or tattoos really don't have a huge long-term evolutionary impact. Human population growth. Human population is over 7 billion people. Increasing populations and greater reliance on technology means that we rely more on specialized socioeconomic systems. We have to be able to produce so much more food, and our resources are so much more limited that we've got to figure out ways to make things work differently. Population growth also means an increase in population density. As the population grows, genetic diversity tends to increase. So you have your good and your bad there. direct genetic manipulation. Thanks to genetic engineering, it is possible to alter allele frequencies and create new alleles. One effect of the hype around genetic manipulation is the increase in geneticization. And this is the use of genetics to explain health and social problems over other possible causes. If any of you have taken like an ancestry or whatnot, you have the possibility of doing the health side, which can show you these genetic possibilities. But they can be used as a form of social control. So there have been a couple movies out that have shown the possibilities. We've seen in your genetic code that you are most likely going to kill someone, so we're going to kill you. That kind of thing. It's the good and the bad. So, we won't know if any of these genetic manipulations have any long-term effect on our species, or if it's just simple manipulation like a tattoo or a piercing. Yet. Adaptive behavioral patterns. Oh no, it is unknown how much of our current behavioral patterns emerged during our evolutionary past and how much expresses our broad behavioral potential made possible by specific current environments. Modern human behavior emerges through the life experiences of an individual and political, economic, and historical contexts. So it does not necessarily reflect a specific past adaptation. Okay, and this is your review for the chapter. So we definitely learned a lot about life changes and what mechanisms are incorporated within the evolutionary process. So, biocultural patterns and their effect on evolution. Think COVID-19 and social distancing. And are modern humans evolving? Where might we be headed? That could be a very interesting question for a discussion question. Okay, so now that you're done with chapter 3, go ahead and go over to the discussion board section, write your 2 discussion board questions, and respond to a peer, and then take the quiz. And I will see you for chapter 4. Have a good day.